In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the topic of Nibiru, or ancient Planet X. Now, this is a very interesting topic simply because, being raised as a Christian for myself, there are many references to, in Revelations, things like Armageddon or Wormwood or some type of apocalyptic biblical event that we hear about in ancient times being tied to things like the Great Flood. Now, a lot of this information told in even the Old Testament in Hebrew, as well as the English version, the King James New Testament, are consolidated versions of a much longer epic of creation found in the original stone versions of the Sumerian culture. And this is really where the term Nibiru, planet of the crossing, starts to come into play. And anyone who's learned about these topics like Planet X or Nibiru from looking online can see that there's a vast amount of interest in today's search for this ancient Planet X. We'll talk about the modern Planet X in an upcoming lesson. Today, we want to focus on the specific points of evidence around the ancient Planet X, Nibiru, the knowledge talked about when this planet was visible in the sky, as well as what ramifications it has had in the ancient past. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some of the evidence. When we study the original biblical story, we can see that this idea of a great flood permeates into many different cultures. Now, I focus specifically on the Sumerian culture, which is pretty much today's modern-day Iraq. We've heard it known as Mesopotamia and Babylon, but originally at around 3800 BC, we have Sumer. And amongst the thousands of stone tablets from this Sumerian culture, we have references of these beings, the Anunnaki, coming from a very specific point within our solar system, a planet called Nibiru. So let's kind of explore some of this factual data that talks about this planet Nibiru and its interaction with our ancient planet Earth. Now, this is one of the most infamous tablets known from the Sumerian lexicon of information. It's called the Enuma Elish. It consists of over several tablets that tell a much more elongated tale about life and creation in general. And it speaks of not only our solar system and the planets coming into existence, but more specifically us, and why there was a great flood. Not that there was just a great flood, but what caused this great flood. And it was the passing of this planet Nibiru. The actual home world of the gods comes close to the inner part of our solar system. And when this took place thousands of years ago in the past, maybe even millions of years ago, we know that it's had catastrophic effects here on Earth. So the Enuma Elish is a very interesting text simply because of the fact that it tells us all of the information in this Sumerian version that we find in the Hebrew and New Testament in English of our biblical tales. So, like for instance, 7 days of creation in Genesis. Well, there were actually 7 tablets of creation as part of this much longer epic of Enuma Elish. So we must understand that a lot of these biblical references for the Great Flood, speaking of times when there were giants upon the earth, most of this information are just consolidated stories coming from the original derivatives. These are just derivatives from the original story that we find in Sumerian versions. So we want to ask the question is what caused the Great Flood? Nibiru passes Earth in the past, and we've seen that it has had actual gravitational effects and has caused, a great flood in the past. Now, if we look at some of this evidence, we can see that not only is this knowledge of the flood real, but it extends, again, all the way back to the Sumerian times. There is actually a tablet on display in the British Museum as the Flood Tablet. And just like Noah in the English Bible, we have a version in Sumerian where a Sumerian man, Utnapishtim, is chosen by an Anunnaki, a Sumerian god, to build a large craft and take his family and plants and animals from the region and load it onto this ship because of the large flood that's going to be taking place. And in this version, in the Enuma Elish, in this longer epic, They actually explain that as planet Nibiru passed by Earth in the past, it caused one of the great ice sheets to crack off, and it's like dropping a piece of ice in a glass of water, and the water levels just raise instantly. So we have a much longer tale explaining why there was a great flood, and it has to do with this ancient planet X, or Nibiru, passing by us, having gravitational effects that caused the ice sheet to crack off and instantly raise our water levels. So we have to realize that the Great Flood, while it's still looked upon as mythology, we are finding evidence to substantiate this from even further references back in time to this possibly being an actual event that did take place. We have evidence, too, of this ancient mapping system, or an idea that there was knowledge of all of the continents extending well into our history, well beyond the ability to aerial document pieces of topography. Now, this ancient map, the Perry-Reese map, you can see the original here, is very interesting because you can see it has the North and South Pole, all the land masses, every continent listed, the types of animals found within those regions. And no one has an understanding as to how they would be able to accurately map the topography of such a map that goes back, again, well into our history. And there are several references to maps like this. It wasn't just the Perry-Reese map. There's also the Phineas map. The Phineas map is of substantial interest simply because it shows the actual topography of the landmass underneath the ice. Now, we have to realize that there's probably at least a mile thick of ice, and somehow we have maps that are accurately depicting what is underneath the ice. So there's no way that they could have an aerial advantage to see this, let alone the ability to accurately depict the landmass underneath the ice. Now, when we hear this idea of an ancient planet X, we have to understand, or a Nibiru, that the Sumerian version of our solar system had a much, or not much, but a slightly different view of how we classify the planets now. We think that Earth is the third planet from the sun, whereas if you look at the solar system model of coming from outside in, Earth is actually the seventh planet. Sacred number 7, 7 days in a week. It's a very interesting number that we'll come back to. But you can see that this is not to scale. It's an artist rendition to show you that the Sumerian version of our solar system was of 12 planets. They counted the 9 planets that we know of. Our sun, our moon, and then this additional planet, Nibiru, as the 12th member of our solar system. And so it's a very interesting piece of information that they're actually stating that their gods, the Anunnaki, come from this 12th planet. This number 12 permeates through all of the ancient cultures and even up today to knowledge that we use. If you think about it, the 12 disciples of Jesus, the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 Greek Olympians, 12 hours in a day, 12 inches in a foot, 12 months in a year, the 12 zodiacal breakdowns of the heavens. I think I even said 12 inches in a foot. I might have said that twice, but this number 12, again, permeates through all of our knowledge that we still use today and is traced back to this idea of an ancient planet X, Nibiru, the 12th planet as the home of the gods. Now, what we can see about the Sumerian evidence as to why we would even give credence to this ancient planet X, Nibiru, is that most of the astronomical data that they've left us that we can confirm, we see that they are on the level. We can see that they've recorded accurate information over hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years, recording astronomical events. And these tablets were sacred information, only knowledge held by the high priests. So it's not like everyone in the Sumerian culture knew of this astronomical data. This was sacred information, only held by the high priests and passed down over hundreds of years. You could ask a certain astronomer, a Sumerian astronomer, and they would be able to tell you 50 years in advance on what day there would be a solar or a lunar eclipse. So they made very accurate, observations of the skies, just like many other cultures did, and passed this down as sacred information. And many of the biblical references that they talked about actually explain the stars not as living objects, as some modern linguists and archaeologists would interpret, but as physical places that had a life essence. Things like the Earth or Nibiru, or the ways that they would travel to get from Earth to Nibiru, were actually well documented as actual information. So we have to understand that a culture from 6,000 years ago is giving us accurate astronomical data that we now confirm as being accurate. But the kicker of this information is they talk about another planet which we still have yet to confirm, a planet 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. And if we do discover this planet, this is Nibiru, the ancient planet X, where we possibly have ancestors living on that planet. So to understand that they were making very accurate astronomical points of reference is key to interpreting the data when it comes to Nibiru. Now, one of the key pieces that we see here is the fact that, again, they had all this knowledge about our current solar system. They gave the distance between the planets, what the planets look like in outer space, and incidentally calling Earth the 7th planet. Because if you count from outside in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Earth is the 7th planet. So this is pretty interesting information when we realize that not until the late 70s and early 80s, when we sent the Galileo and the Voyager probe out to the outer solar system and finally took pictures of the outer planets, and we see that Uranus and Neptune being bluish green, or as the Sumerians called it, mosh sieg. The Sumerians gave accurate depictions of the outer planets, what the planets even look like from space. And then finally, when we sent our probes there, we confirmed this 6,000-year-old information. Now, the kicker of the information, again, is around planet Nibiru. They clearly reference this other planet. They reference it as a large, glowing red planet. They reference it as a cross, a glowing cross in the sky. A glowing cross. Now, keep in mind, the Sumerian culture is at 3800 BC. The time of Jesus, we're talking about 2014, is roughly 2,000 years ago. If you go back from BC to AD, that point of when Jesus was here, we're going back another 2,000 years from when Jesus was here and you're at the Sumerian culture. So the whole idea that the Sumerian culture are depicting their gods coming from a glowing cross in the sky thousands of years before Jesus and the crucifixion, again, is somewhat interesting. Nibiru, again, is always depicted as a large glowing red planet, and it has its own moon too, so just keep that in mind as we progress through this. Various depictions of Nibiru initially showed it as a glowing cross in the sky. Eventually it started to migrate into more of a circular winged disc, also taking on the shape of a cross in the middle. Eventually you can see as it's transgressed, we see it even in other cultures today, in Egyptian as well as Akkadian and various other Semitic languages, referencing the winged disc as reference to the gods. Here's an actual Sumerian seal, a depiction from a seal, where during daylight you can see the sun is being referenced, and then also Nibiru as a glowing cross seen during daylight time, and they're making reference to it. You can see that they're plowing a field here. So a lot of visual references to understand the lineage of information visually for how they explained planet Nibiru. Now what's really key about planet Nibiru is the story in the Enuma Elish, this great creation myth that's on several stone tablets, talks about how Nibiru became a part of our solar system and talks to this great collision and interaction with our ancient planet Earth. Now, what's really interesting about this information is the idea that even through our modern cosmology, we date the solar system to be about 4.7 billion years old. That there was, at some point, some large explosion, and over time, our solar system and the planets have coalesced into the objects that they are today. Now, this isn't very far off from what the Sumerians tell us, again, in a 6,000-year-old tale recorded in stone tablets of an interaction with this intruder planet and how it fits very much in alignment with the cosmology and creation of our solar system. If we think about the idea of such, a large planetary event of planets colliding or moons striking other planets, these would be solar system-wide effects, things that would be left for us to see thousands of years later and trace back the evidence, like we do now in trying to understand the Big Bang Theory. We see evidence that in our own solar system in the past, there was some large intruder planet that caused a great havoc on our solar system. And it turns out the Sumerians explain it in a much more detailed way than our science can yet convey. The Sumerian version speaks of an intruder planet, which we'll call Planet X, or Nibiru, was gravitationally affected by the outer planets of our solar system. And this is before the planets were solid masses yet. They hadn't finished coalescing. Nibiru is pulled into the inner part of our solar system, so it starts having an actual orbit around our main sun. Now, through the Sumerian tales, they explain that on one of these successive orbits, Nibiru came so close to our primitive Earth that Nibiru's moon whacked our Earth. You see that the Sumerians labeled Nibiru, or Planet X's moon, as North Wind. And North Wind hit Earth in such a way that it literally cracked Earth in two, causing Earth to be moved with our moon, moved into a new orbit, leaving the remnants of the asteroid belt, which we still see today. And the Bible references the asteroid belt as the hammered out bracelet. Remember, those are consolidated tales of this original Sumerian version. So after Nibiru has this interaction where its moon whacks our primitive Earth, causing the asteroid belt, Nibiru then goes on to have this long 3,600-year orbit. We don't understand why it has such a long orbit or what causes it to stay in this orbit, other than to speculate there must be a second sun. Imagine my cursor is another sun. Nibiru is orbiting around a second sun, a brown dwarf, something that we've known about for a long time, probably longer than we think, which I'm going to touch about on the end, touching on this lost cycle of time. But this is a new variable to explain Nibiru's orbit being able to go way far out and loop back around. It's probably going around the second sun. Now, the Sumerians gave this visual a name. They called a completed orbit a shar. And it was 3,600 years was what they denoted as a complete shar. Now, if you just drop 1 0, you have 360 degrees, which was also the first value given to a circle by the Sumerians, 360 degrees. Or add a 0 and it's a shar, a completed circle. Now, if we think about the idea of a great collision cracking our Earth into half a planet, then this brings up some interesting questions again about our very early cosmology. We understand the idea of Pangea, that at one point the continents were all connected. We can see it. If we look at our map today, we can, without a doubt, confirm that all the continents actually connect in some way, where you can see that this continent would connect into here, this one into here. They literally all kind of move up into each other. They all fit. So that, again, is confirming the Sumerian cosmology that we're half a planet, one landmass. Now, all planets siphon into a sphere, but if you sucked off all the water, it'd just be a chunk of land. And like the skin of an apple, our land masses have just kind of moved into where they are now, but they were originally just one chunk of land. Now, a lot of people have asked about Nibiru's current orbit in the fact that in ancient times, we know that it had this interaction that caused part of the great ice sheet to crack off and have a great flood. We know that it has an orbit that lasts 3,600 years based on the Sumerian information. And we know that our solar system has roughly been around for 4.7 billion years. So if we take the idea that our solar system is 4.7 billion years old, and Nibiru, Planet X, has been looping in the solar system in that whole time, which takes 3,600 years for it to complete an orbit, we can simply do a mathematical equation and see that Nibiru is passed through the inner part of the solar system well over 1 million times. It's very possible that not every time it passes through the inner part of the solar system that it's going to have an effect here on Earth. We're talking about three-dimensional space. Nibiru could be here, the sun could be here, and the Earth way over here. Now, another interesting thing to note is that if we look at the distance between the planets spatially to each other, we can see that where the asteroid belt is, this remnants from that last collision of Nibiru and Earth in the ancient past, we see that where the asteroid belt is, there's clearly enough room between Mars and Jupiter for Nibiru to pass through. Another thing to note, if we think about this planet X being the 12th planet, and the 12th planet passes between Mars and Jupiter, well, then we could take the analogy of MJ12 could possibly mean something. If you don't know what that term is, you can Google it, MJ12. So just getting to the point that, again, Nibiru possibly doesn't always have gravitational effects on Earth every time it's close by the inner part of our solar system. Now, ancient knowledge of Nibiru. This is rather interesting because, as we can see, there's been a great deal of information explaining the cosmology of our solar system with this original collision with Nibiru and Planet X. Well, on the Discovery Channel recently, they explained that a rogue planet collides with our primitive Earth. And in doing so, the remnant fragments coalesce to make our moon. They called this the Orpheus theory. Well, that sounds very similar to the Sumerian versions of the cosmology creation of our solar system. So as they're trying to figure it out, all they need to do is look to the past to find the answers. Even until recent times, the idea of a planet on an elongated orbit was far-fetched to NASA. They had yet to image any type of extrasolar planet or star in an orbit that was not a perfect circle or was on some highly elliptical orbit, if you will. Well, they found one. Here it is. A little star going around, a planet going around a much larger star that, again, this isn't our solar system, but it's on a highly elliptical orbit. And they found that this became the norm, finding planets that were dancing around binary solar systems. Most solar systems, in fact, that we're filming outside of our own, using the Hubble and other telescopes, which we'll look into in the next lesson, the modern search for Planet X. But there's a great deal of new astronomical data to show that the orbits that we thought were just impossible are now becoming the norm, and that our solar system itself is possibly binary, 2 suns. Where's our second sun, you would ask? So when we look at this evidence of Nibiru, we have to understand that this information is kind of new to us. It's kind of being rediscovered. Even through the ages, just coming out of the Dark Ages until the Renaissance time, we thought we orbited, we didn't realize that we orbited the sun. We thought that the Earth was the center of the universe. Through the work of Copernicus and Galileo and others, we've discovered that we actually orbit the sun. Well, this information was well known to the Sumerians. Again, there is this cycle of time, which I'm going to continually weave into the lessons as I talk about it, but it seems as if during the Sumerian and Egyptians 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, they had high astronomy and knew all this information. And then we dip into the Dark Ages and lose all this information. And only coming out of the Dark Ages, Copernicus, Galileo, we start to re-understand astronomy as to where we are today, almost 4,000 years later, with an understanding and an acceptance of our solar system model. But we're still learning. The Sumerians clearly pointed out that they too knew that the sun was in the center thousands of years ago. It's almost like, again, we had to rediscover this information. But you can see on this Sumerian tablet that the sun is in the center, and they depict all of the known planets that we know of in their correct size and order. But they've included one more, Nibiru, Planet X. So when we look at our solar system model and understand that they speak of our solar system from seeing it from the outside, from their venture coming into the solar system, seeing us as not on the third rock, but on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 planets we passed before we came to Ki, the 7th planet. Here's a blow-up of that seal. Some very interesting details in the seal. You can see that this priest is leading another man to the seated God, and he's granting man the plow. But as a backdrop to this information, we have an accurate model of our solar system. And right below that, we have what appears to be a rocket on a launching pad. Like a modern-day rocket ship, it sits on a pad. It's being held up by a support that will fall away once the rocket takes off into the stars. On a 6,000-year-old tablet, they're depicting this type of information. So we have to understand that this probably isn't mythology, folks. These are real events. Nibiru is a real planet, and the beings, the Anunnaki, are real themselves. Now, when we look at the evidence of the Anunnaki, again, we've seen great details and information given to us by the Sumerian culture, where they went to great lengths to explain, describe this interaction with what the Bible once called there were giants upon the earth. Well, the Sumerians were living in that epoch of time. They called these beings the Anunnaki. And over, even the modern day depictions of angels in the Bible are speaking of a much earlier epoch of time where we have earlier references of these beings, the Anunnaki. And where do they come from? Not just the heavens, from planet Nibiru. So we have to understand that if we ever actually do find this ancient planet X, not Sedna or Quoar or Xena or these things that are demoting Pluto, they're finding little ice balls floating out there. Ancient Nibiru is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. It's a big planet. We're not going to miss it. And if we do locate that planet, we possibly have ancestors that live on that planet. So we have to understand that this is some very interesting information when ancient man went to great lengths to convey what they saw, telling us that ancient gods had the power of flight, just like we today symbolize birds landing on the moon. We had the power of flight. So it's very possible that we just need to look a little bit harder and understand this evidence that we're getting from the ancient cultures, because over and over they talk about this glowing cross in the sky, and that these great beings, the Anunnaki, came from this planet. And again, very momentous occasions were recorded in stone of these interactions with these beings. They didn't make this stuff up, folks. If we're ever to be prepared for the next time we have an interaction with these ancient gods, we must first understand the ancient past and see the wealth of information that they've left us. We probably know exactly where Nibiru is. We just need to know exactly where to look. So there is some interesting information, again, that comes out of the Sumerian epic, because our modern sciences are starting to understand things in space in a much different view than we did, let's say, 20 years ago. So we have to start to look at some of this Sumerian evidence and realize that they're telling us information that speaks well beyond their time frame to us now with our technology. This is a Sumerian tablet that is circular in form, which in itself is interesting because they thought the shape of an ellipse or a circle was unknown to ancient man. That's why we didn't see wheeled carts and buggies being used. Well, actually, that's exactly what they were using, and they even created circular tablets. This tablet specifically had very interesting astronomical data from what they were able to interpret. This area specifically, other areas badly damaged. But when we look at this area specifically, we see that it talks about saying things along the edge that are mountain, rocket, pile up, high, 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 giving reference to the idea that this was an actual route taken by Lord Enki from their planet Nibiru, having to pass by 7 planets, or coming to the 7th planet by taking a certain route in the solar system, actually described on a Sumerian tablet. So again, we have to realize that this can't just be mythological data about Planet X, because they went to great lengths to speak about and retain the information bequeathed by the Anunnaki to the Sumerian culture. about where they came from and what they believed in. There's some very interesting information recorded in many of the books by Zecharia Sitchin, like the Lost Book of Enki, that speak of specific tablets where high priests were recording information about the beliefs of Enki. One of those was, do you believe in God? Do you believe in something that is a creator of all life? And the Anunnaki's response to the Sumerian priest was, we believe in a one life force that creates everything. They call it the father of all creation. I thought that was a nice saying. But we have to understand that the Sumerian tablets, cylinder seals, pictograms, and the texts clearly paint a picture for us of a time when these Anunnaki were here on Earth. And they gave references over and over. One just has to look. Visual references, without even reading cuneiform script, of a glowing cross in the sky, of a time when the gods visited from this planet Nibiru, and over gave reference to it as a glowing cross, as a winged disc, as the ability to use the technology of this winged disc and come here to Earth. That's exactly what we see over and over. You can see the cylinder seal here is given a very interesting depiction or a description in French, unfortunately, because this is the Louvre. But the artist was nice enough to carve out what we see here as the actual little seals. A DNA symbol of a double helix, the winged disc, and then, information of other symbols that, again, are like little acronyms. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, FYI, for your information. That's what we see in these hieroglyphic information. One symbol could mean several words. It doesn't just mean bird. It means something. It has like an acronym meaning. They were able to communicate visually in much more in-depth ways. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And that's exactly what we see. Over and over again, certain symbolic references that when put together, there are scenes being explained. Something to do with the winged disc, possibly Nibiru or Anunnaki, information being given, right? I unfortunately cannot translate cuneiform script, but I can look at the symbolic references over and over and see that certain ones are being displayed and discussed. Here again, winged disc. Now this time, what we also see are the 7 dots of Earth. As I showed you earlier, coming from outside of our solar system we're on the 7th planet. Now, modern archaeologists would look at this and say, that's the 7 sisters of Pleiades, that star system. What? No, it's representing Earth. Again, the winged disc, some type of reference of Nibiru, or this traveling ability with the Anunnaki having the ability to utilize this type of flight technology. How else could they explain flight technology without the use of showing it with wings? And that's exactly what we see over and over in great detail. A being piloting a circular craft, having the power of flight, coming from Nibiru. I mean, over and over we see these types of esoteric depictions that aren't just a man next to a flying object. They are conveying things through acronym visual references. So this is some very deep data that they, again, went to great lengths to convey to us. And over we see these same references, astronomical symbols of the planets, Saturn even being depicted with its ring. These things weren't even able to be seen without astronomical references. So it's very interesting that we have such complete data records from a culture that's 6,000 years old. Now, this symbol again of ancient Nibiru as a cross in the sky, here it is, Nibiru with its crescent moon. Earth, the 7 dots of Earth with our crescent moon. These things aren't hard to understand once you make the reference and the connection. So part of the information here does take an interesting turn in the fact that, while we're looking for extrasolar planets and looking into the ancient past and understanding their tracking of solar system movements, we also see in the Yucatan, on other planets, large evidence of asteroid impacts, things that could have had a gravitational or catastrophic effect in the past because of their gravitational effects. And this really does raise the question around things we need to be doing to support our current space program. This question is asked often, right? Will the ancient Planet X, will Nibiru, even people claiming to see it now, that it's being hidden by the sun, or they've got pictures of it with their webcam? I don't think so. Nibiru is 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. It's a large planet, folks. We're not going to miss it. And you'll see in next week's lesson that the ability for us to track such a large object is very capable for us to do with the amount of amateur astronomers all over the Earth. Sure, there are blind spots, but we cover enough of the solar system to be seeing anything that's going to be 4 to 8 times the size of Earth. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for next week's lesson.